let's start and mask, only me. Welcome to the 2020 Journal of European Integration annual lecture. My name is Olivier Costa. I'm the Director of Studies in the European and Political Governance Department at the College of Europe, and I'm one of the executive editor of the Journal of European Integration. This is the third annual lecture of the Journal of European Integration. It's a very old journal, but we had the idea of annual lecture only for the 40th anniversary, and we started that tradition in 2018. So just a few words about the journal that was established in 1978, published today by Taylor and Francis. And so the Journal of European Integration is one of the main journals in EU studies, publishing work that deal mainly with political science, but also political economy, public administration, law, history, sociology, and cultural studies. And the journal tries to cover all the aspects of European integration process. We have an editorial team which is composed of executive editor Thomas Christiansen, a professor at Lewis University in Rome, who was formerly a professor at the College of Europe, and myself, and then editors Maya Davis-Cross from Northeastern University in Boston, and Anya Junkos in Bristol University, and who's also a professor at the College of Europe in the IRD department. And then we have Giulia Gallinera at the Lewis University Rome, who is the editorial manager, and Pauline Tinus, who's sitting here, who is in charge of the journal social media channel. So the journal is mainly located in Rome, but also a bit in Bruges, a bit in Boston, a bit in Bristol. So my dear colleagues from the editorial committee were prevented to come to Bruges to listen to Sven because of the sanitary situation, but I know that they are online following us. So Anna, Maya, Giulia, Thomas, hi from Bruges. And you are free to ask questions via our very sophisticated system of online question. So this is the third edition. In 2018, we had the chance to add a lecture by Nathalie Tocci, who was working for Rector Mogherini at that time in Brussels in the frame of the conference EU in International Affairs, which is chaired by Florian Trauner. In 2019, Calypso Nicolaides from Oxford University came in that very room to talk about Brexit. And so this year I'm very pleased to welcome Sven BISCOP to talk about the place of the EU in the world. So this event is jointly organized with Florian Trauner, just sitting at my right, who is the chair of the EU in International Affairs Conference. Sven was supposed to speak during that conference in spring 2020 in Brussels, but this was canceled as all conference, and that's why we've decided to organize that here. And I'm really happy that we are still capable to do that in a way, in a physical way, at least for some of you, because we have the chance to have 70 students in the room. Just a few words about Sven BISCOP. He's professor at University of Ghent, where he's lecturing on strategy and foreign policy of Belgium and the European Union. And he's also director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels. This is a think tank attached to the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has extensively published on those topics of foreign affairs. He has taught in too many places to tell, including the College of Europe. And he just published a book at Routledge titled European Strategy in the 21st Century, which will be more or less the topic of the discussion today. He will publish a paper linked to his speech later this year in November in the Journal of European Integration. So the program today will be an introduction by Federica Mogherini, Rector of the College of Europe, so there is no need to present her to the students here. Let me just recall that she was Minister of Foreign Affairs in Italy, and then High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the Commission, and we have the chance to have her as a rector since the 1st of September 2020 here at the college. I couldn't find a better person to introduce that discussion about the place and the role of the EU at global level, and I'm impatient to hear a view on that. Then I will give the floor to Sven for a presentation of something like 45 minutes. Then we'll have questions from the room and from the web through many things I don't understand. But if you are on Twitter, you can use the hashtag JEI2020 to tag your question, and then we'll locate them, and they will be transferred magically on that screen. And at the end, I will invite Florian Trauner to conclude the conference. He's a professor at the VUB in Brussels, visiting professor at the College of Europe in the EIS program in Nathalie. And so he's the chair of that conference that was supposed to organize the keynote of Sven earlier this year. So, Director, dear Federica, the floor is yours, and you're allowed to remove your mask.
Thank you. Merci, Olivier. Thank you, Sven. Thanks to all for being here. Let me also say a remote, warm welcome and greetings to all colleagues that are following us, not only from their rooms here in Bruges, but also from different corners of the world. A special one to those that are following from Rome, if you allow me. And thank you for inviting me to say a few words at the beginning of this lecture. I am actually very curious to hear the lecture itself, because I think the title, and we were discussing this just a few minutes ago, I think the title is an interesting one. And I'm very curious about the lecture itself. I would actually try to say a few words about what I think the title suggests, but then I'll be in a listening mode. I think that the corona crisis at the beginning of this year opened somehow the hope of a perspective of a more cooperative world order. And this is traditionally the space where the European Union positions itself and plays a role. Why do I say so? Because a pandemic, a global pandemic of a nature and a size that was unknown in not only in this century, but also in the previous, almost the previous century, would have logically brought decision makers and public opinions towards bridge building and cooperative strategies to overcome both the sanitary but also the economic aspects of the pandemic, not to mention the social one. So I remember very well that, well, I think we realized at different times, depending on in which part of the world you were located, that the pandemic was coming. But I would say that between March, around March, we started to think, well, maybe this is an opportunity for support for multilateral organizations. The role of the World Health Organization, for instance, became quite crucial and evident. This could be an opportunity for more cooperation on development of medical treatments, think of the vaccine, more cooperation in terms of supply chains of all kinds of equipments that were needed to face the emergency of the sanitary situation. So opportunities were opening up for a different kind of paradigm to be followed worldwide, a paradigm that was very much in the notes of the discourse that the European Union has been advocating for a while, and for sure since the global strategy was adopted, but also before. More cooperation as a response to a more conflictual world order. But then I think the title of the lecture suggests us that this is not really what happened in reality, and this is something that happens often, especially in global politics. You logically think that the developments could bring you somewhere, and then actually reality brings you another place. And a strategy is probably what you do to try to react to this shift between the expectations and the reality as you see it developing. What we're seeing in these months is actually a lot of political use of communication around the pandemic and the responsibilities for it, the response to it, a lot of propaganda. We've seen a lot of political communication, let's say it this way, going around that. And we've seen, I think, that's my reading, I would say a hardening of the positions that were there already before the pandemic. Those that were convinced multilateralists and convinced that more cooperation on the world stage would have been beneficial for the world of before the pandemic, found even more reasons to believe so and argue in this direction. But those that were clearly advocating for a more unilateral approach towards dynamics or a more bilateral way of solving disputes or conflicts probably also found in the pandemic and its developments arguments to try and reinforce their positions. I think a defining moment for Europe has been, for the European Union in particular, has been probably have been two. One has been the difficulty with which at the beginning solidarity was put in motion. But then it happened with less visibility, I would say, than one could have expected. I think of the sanitary support. I think of the medical doctors traveling from one place to the other of Europe, or assistance in hospitals offered to patients of different countries in the European Union. And then the recovery fund that I think is the major point where the European narrative around the post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic, eventually post-pandemic world will come. But then defining a strategy for the European Union for the next years, the 2020s is now the next decade, I think would imply not only a role of the European Union in relation to how the other global powers will position themselves. I think of China for sure, I think of Russia, but I also think of the United States after the next US elections. This is a big question mark to be defined. And on the other side, how I think, you would not expect that from me, I'm not an economist and don't understand much about economy, but I think that defining EU strategy for the 2020s will have to do a lot with the place of Europe in the world, but also a lot on how the European Union will manage to avoid a major economic and financial crisis for the continent in this decade, having experienced one just last decade. I think this is going to be probably the make it or break it challenge for the European Union in the 2020s. I don't bother you much more on this or other issues. I'm very much interested and curious in hearing the lecture, and I'm just sorry that I cannot stay for the 2 hours. Unfortunately, I have another meeting to run to, but I will stay for sure for the lecture and take notes. So I apologize if at a certain moment around 3 o'clock I will have to leave. But I wish you all a good interaction after the lecture. And thank you for organizing this in Bruges. Sorry it was not possible to do it in spring in Brussels, but somehow happy that we managed to get this opportunity to do it still in presence, mostly in presence. This is a good opportunity for our students, for our college, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, dear Rector, for welcoming us here. And I leave the floor now to Sven BISCOP.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the beautiful introductions. Thank you to the Rector and the organizers. As was said, it's a bit of a return in a way to Bruges, because I used to teach a course here on EU foreign policy by coincidence for exactly 10 years. But I gave up, not because I didn't like it anymore, but then in 2016 I got a chance to assume a half-time professorship in Ghent, which is my own university, which I continue to combine with my job at the Egmont Institute. And although every academic has his share of vanity, that's what keeps the business turning, I felt I should not try to monopolize all the interesting jobs in the field. And so then I, with a somewhat heavy heart, resigned from the course here. But it's nice to be back for a moment. And as Federica Mogherini said, nice to speak for an audience that is actually here. I suffer from one sadly incurable symptom of the coronavirus, which is an absolute dislike of online-only events. There is no medicine for it, but I will be stuck with it for a little while more, unfortunately. There you go. I should probably add, just to make sure, Ghent University is the best university in Belgium, everybody knows that. The Egmont Institute is a think tank of the Belgian Foreign Ministry. physically located inside the ministry, but mentally we're outside. So I will give you the most individual expression of the most individual emotion. Nobody from the Egmont Institute ever speaks for the Kingdom of Belgium. We now actually have a government even who does speak for the kingdom, but even when we don't, it's never Egmont, just so that you know that. What I want to do is start with my assessment of the current international environment and then address 4 issues that I feel should be areas of focus of European strategy. And my starting point will be exactly the same as director, that in the end, it turned out that the coronavirus, from the point of view of international politics, did not change all that much. I was a bit worried because, I mean, during the lockdown, what did I do? Okay, at first, I started to finish all the projects that were ongoing. And after just about a month, all these articles were finished. And I thought, alors, what do we do now? And then I had for a long time had a plan to write a new book. And I thought, well, I'll just write it about the great powers and their relations. But I was doubting. I thought, but surely the corona crisis changes everything. But if you think a little bit more, it doesn't really. It rather aggravates the existing trends, but it doesn't really upturn international politics because there are no clear winners or losers of the coronavirus. That's to say, you see that the weak states are getting even weaker, but the strong states, they have the resources to maintain their power base. And so if you look at the great powers, the United States, China, Russia, and we, the European Union, it was a terrible shock for all of us, domestically, politically, in economic terms, but these 4 great powers have the resources to overcome the crisis. If they fail, it will be only because they make it difficult for themselves, in a way. And so the balance of power between those 4 doesn't really change all that much, at least so far. And so it remains the interaction between those 4 that will largely determine international politics in the coming decades. And what we see is worrying trends, increasing competition and rivalry among them, putting in doubt of multilateralism, questioning of economic globalization. So how do we deal with that? How do we need to read this world of increasing tensions between great powers? Well, I like to start with a quote from my favorite author and my favorite book by my favorite author, and the quote goes more or less like this: Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia because the enemy of the day represented pure evil, so that one could not imagine any agreement with it, neither in the past nor in the future. That's from George Orwell's 1984. And in the geopolitics of 1984, there are actually 3 great powers: Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. And if you've read it, you know that it's not true. Oceania has not always been at war with Eurasia. The main character remembers vaguely that some years ago, Oceania was at war with East Asia. But for the regime of Oceania, it doesn't really matter with whom it is at war. It just has to be at war with one of the other 2. Because being at war justifies the tyranny of 1984, the tyranny of Oceania, and that war must not be won. Actually, it should be everlasting, because that is how the system keeps in place. It is not my argument that we are in a similar situation, but I do think there are elements in our current environment that create a risk of us ending up in a permanent state of rivalry without end. Why is that? Because in the strategic establishments, many in the strategic establishments of the great power do not seem to be willing to accept reality. We are in a multipolar world. I mean, I'm an academic, but I'm not a great theoretician. So multipolarity is simply defined. You have more than 2 great powers. Voila. None of these is powerful enough to dominate the others. So it's the interaction between them that determines the shape of world politics. That is normal, right? If you look at the history of Europe, since the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, 476, we've had multipolarity, with the big exception of the Cold War and the illusion for a decade after the Cold War of American-dominated unipolarity. But now we're back to normal. I mean, normal doesn't mean fun. Normal doesn't mean we have to like it, but it is normality. So you have more than one great power. I would say today we have the four that I listed. What is a great power? It's a state with the ambition to have global impact and the resources to act upon that ambition. So logically, those four great powers, they are present everywhere. They are present in the same regions, in the same organizations, in the same policy areas, and so naturally they compete for markets, for resources, for friends, for political influence. But that competition is inherent to international politics. That's what politics is. Even in domestic politics, if you create a political party, ipso facto you are in competition with the other political parties. However, because these great powers are also present in the same theaters, often actually they will find that their interests also overlap. And so cooperation between the powers is as natural as competition. And the great powers are usually quite good at compartmentalizing their relations. They cooperate on one issue while they heartily disagree on another, right? Look at our relations with Russia. There's a sanctions regime against Russia because of the Ukrainian war, but at the same time we continue to import Russian energy. So competition and cooperation are both natural aspects of international politics. Rivalry, however, is a choice. Rivalry means that you consciously decide to purposely act against one of the other great powers. You will try to subvert it, subvert its political system by corrupting its officials, by spreading fake news, influencing its elections, by espionage, sabotage, and what have you. Or you will try to coerce it, you will threaten it with economic sanctions or the use of force to push it into decisions that it doesn't really want to make. Or eventually you will aggress it. You will use your military force against it. So rivalry is a conscious choice. Cooperation and competition are inevitable. That's just what politics is. Rivalry is not inevitable. That is a conscious choice. But I find that more and more we have stopped making the distinction between competition and rivalry. And there are many that see the mere existence of another power as a threat to their own existence. Many in the American strategic establishment consider the fact that China is a great power in itself to be a threat to American power. And that is very dangerous because that leads to a rivalry without end. If the existence in itself of China as a great power is a problem, then when will you be satisfied? Then you can only be satisfied if at some point China says, all right, we give up. We abandon our global ambition. We pull out of Africa. We stop the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll still claim that Taiwan is Chinese, but no, don't worry. This is for domestic purposes only. We don't really mean it. We abandon totally any ambition in foreign policy. Or there is some big catastrophe, economic catastrophe or revolution, and there is a big regime change in China. That is then the only way this kind of rivalry can end. Either scenario is unlikely in China or vice versa. Either scenario is unlikely in America. So if this is what we come to believe, that the mere existence in itself of another power is a threat, that is a dangerous path. That leads us to a state of permanent rivalry that cannot be won in a way. And then we are at risk of becoming cynical. If rivalry is a permanent situation, at some point one may get settled into this. It will certainly suit some interest groups. And then in the end, if rivalry is permanent anyway, does it still matter who the rival is? Maybe not. Maybe not. So that is a certain slippery slope that we are on. Whereas I think until now, the mainstream thinking in Europe, and certainly the official EU position, is different. It's to say the fact that China is a great power, it's in a way normal. If you look at its history, look at its size, in itself, that's not a threat. It depends on how China behaves. What does it do with its power? If it aims it against us, it becomes a problem. If China behaves more or less according to the rules of the international game, then we can accommodate it. Now, you might say, okay, that's perhaps true, but China is a dictatorship. China is an authoritarian state, and we are democratic states. And that is true, but to put it very bluntly, from the point of view of international politics, that is not very relevant, because this is about interests. What is the vital interest of the European Union? Our vital interest is not how China treats the Chinese or how Russia treats the Russians. Our vital interest is, how does China treat us? How do the Russians treat us? That is our vital interest. That does not mean that we do not have to care about human rights in China or in Russia, but we have to be aware of our leverage and of the nature of the issues. Of course, human rights are universal. If they were not universal, they would be called European rights or Belgian rights or Flemish rights. So if we say that we believe that human rights exist, then we must accept that they are universal, and so they apply to everybody, including every citizen of China. Therefore, we have a moral duty to speak out about human rights, as we are doing. But at the same time, we must be aware of the limitations of our leverage. It is unlikely that we will say that we will cut our trade relations with China until they treat the Uyghurs better. We will not, because it would, economically, we could not afford it, and the Chinese know that too, of course. Furthermore, for China, control over Xinjiang, control over Hong Kong is a vital interest. For us, it is not. If you engage another power on what for it is vital, while it isn't vital for you, it is unlikely that you can win this competition. So in a way, we must continue to speak up for human rights against all hope, in a way, in order to maintain the discourse, in order to maintain the norm that respect for human rights is normality and violating human rights is abnormal. But we do it having in mind the motto of William the Silent, Guillaume le Taciturne. Point ne faut-il espérer pour entreprendre, ni réussir pour persévérer. You don't need to have hope to undertake something, nor do you need to have success to persevere in it. You have to continue to do it in the full knowledge that in the short term, the impact may be very limited. Just like during the Cold War, for 45 years, we strongly condemned the Soviet Union for its disrespect of human rights. What did it do about it? Nothing whatsoever, except occasionally allowing one or the other high-profile dissident to leave the Soviet Union and settle in the West. That's it. And it is very likely that it will be the same vis-à-vis China. That is not encouraging. That is not a very... Well, I wish I could have come to another conclusion. But if I look at the facts, this is sadly the conclusion that I arrive at. So we must maintain the discourse, but we have little leverage when it comes to the domestic politics of the other great powers. However, we do have leverage when it comes to their foreign policy, where if they cross our red lines and if they become too assertive, we can use the instruments of power that we have, especially in our case, our economic power. So that is my reading of this current interplay between the great powers. We must accept that multipolarity is normal. We must accept that it is normal that the great powers compete, but it is not inevitable that they become rivals, let alone enemies. That can still be avoided. So we must also accept that it will be very difficult to change their domestic behavior, but we do have leverage to try and influence their external behavior, and that is also our vital interests. So how do we go about that? 4 strands of strategy that I want to talk about. And in a way, I think these 4 strands fit in the current overarching grand strategic document of the EU, which is a 2016 global strategy, which represented a turning point when I think the EU came to realize the point of having an EU foreign policy is not only to be nice to people. The point is to defend the European interest. And of course, we try to find ways to defend our interests. We try to create win-win situations, but it has to be about interests. If it's not about interest, the member states will not care about it, and they will not invest in it. This has been called principled pragmatism. And because we had this sort of turned towards interest. The global strategy for the first time defined the vital interests of the Union, said we want to protect the EU and its citizens, we want to maintain our democratic system, we want to maintain our economic prosperity, and in order to be able to do that, we need a rules-based international order. And from that more pragmatic approach, we derived 5 priorities, which I somewhat paraphrase, saying 1, defend Europe itself, 2, keep our broad neighborhood stable, 3, create a civilian military power projection capacity, 4, try to stabilize in diplomatic ways regions that are geopolitically contested, 5, try to create effective global governance, try to pull in the other powers into strong multilateral cooperation. I think if I read those 5 priorities, those are still the right priorities. Now, I have a mixed feeling in the sense that it took us 13 years to move from the previous strategy, 2003, to the current one, 2016, because the EU doesn't have a system to regularly update its strategic thinking. It's still my view that ideally after every European election, we should have an update of the global strategy. Just like in the US, every president for every term has to submit a new edition of the national security strategy to Congress. Maybe sometimes, having thought about it, you decide we don't need to change too much. That's fine. You don't change it because you've thought about it. But in our case, for 13 years almost, we refused to think about it. Then, of course, one day you wake up and you realize that you've been overtaken by events. So I still feel that as a principle, we ought to have a similar mechanism, even though I think the current global strategy is by and large still fit for purpose. I just think that what our job is now is to take into account the changed environment, which since 2016, let's say, the trends are still going in the same direction, but perhaps faster than we thought even in 2016, and to take that into account when we try to implement these priorities. And then I want to highlight 4 points. 1, relations between the great powers, so between ourselves and the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans. You see that the EU currently, Federica Mogherini's successor, Josep Borrell, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, try to craft a discourse, try to carefully position the EU and saying, look, in this Sino-American rivalry, we are not choosing sides. We're obviously not siding with China, but we're also not simply siding with the Americans. We choose our side. We stand for the EU interests. This is not an equidistant position. We are clearly much closer to the US in terms of our way of life and so on, but the interests are not entirely the same. And so you have to look out for your own interest. Borrell has called this the Sinatra doctrine. I did it my way. If there's anybody French in the audience, he or she knows, of course, that this is originally a song by Claude François, Comme d'habitude. So there's a certain risk that, comme d'habitude, we say it and then we don't do it. That we must be careful for. I think the higher up then got into the habit, so now he described the relationship with China, EU-China, as je t'aime, moi non plus, which is not bad as trouvaille. And so the EU says to China, look, in the past, we've probably been a little bit too friendly, right? You've said our market is totally open to yours. Would it not be polite if you would reciprocate? Now we say our market is totally open to yours. It would only be fair if you would reciprocate. If you don't, there will be consequences. We may not adopt sanctions like the Americans do and cut back on existing relations, but surely any future relationship, there will be limits if you do not reciprocate. You could, I always paraphrase it as saying, our message to China is, we want to work with you whenever you can, but 1, you have to give us something to work with. 2, we will also push back when we must. So it's a more transactional approach, to use that word. Does it work? It seemed to work last year. The EU, the Commission published its communication on China in March of last year, said China is a partner and a competitor and a rival all at once. That kind of surprised the Chinese to get this kind of language from us. And then we got the EU-China summit in April, at which they committed to quite concrete undertakings, notably the idea that we should try this year to finally finish our bilateral investment treaty. But then they began to drag their feet again. And of course, the Corona crisis, disturbed the preparation a lot. But I think the Chinese also miscalculated a bit and thought that we wanted a deal so badly that we would accept any deal. And I think this is definitely not the case for the EU institutions. Perhaps one or the other member state, yes. And so we see that it has not yet worked as well as we thought, although I do think it is the right approach to say to China, look, we are quite happy to work with you. We think there is space for China, but you also have to give us something. It can't be one-sided. The problem is the pushback part, right? Cooperate when you can, that's easy, we're used to that. Push back when you must, that's a bit less in the DNA of the Union until now. And you see, of course, that certainly in the areas where unanimity is required, there's always one or the other member state who refuses to take firm action against China, and that is a very serious handicap for us. This is also a message to the United States. It's saying, look, we have a very close relationship. Our preference is, of course, to defend our interests together with you, but if on a certain topic interests diverge, we reserve the right to have our own policy, and we reserve the right to define our relations with other actors according to our assessment. It's not because the US says that state A or B is a rival that it has to be a rival of the European Union. We want to claim our freedom of action. But again, the implementation is sometimes difficult. Look at the Iran dossier. There is a clear EU position, which goes against the US position, or rather the US changed its position and now goes against us, pulling out of the nuclear deal, but we cannot bring it into practice. The INSTEX mechanism that's supposed to shield our companies from American extraterritorial sanctions, which is a very severe instrument to use against your friends, doesn't work. And so we're a bit in a halfway situation, I find sometimes. We've done enough to stake out our own position to upset the Americans, but we've not done enough to then defend our interests. And so we've upset our allies, and maybe we've tempted our competitors. We can't stay here. We must now advance and draw the logical conclusions from this and continue on this path. And I think the course that has been set out by the EU, the Sinatra doctrine, is the way ahead. But it requires really strong unity. I'll be briefer on the other points. I'll give you that for your psychological ease. Number 2, multilateralism. The EU has declared that a rules-based international order as such is one of our vital interests. It's a matter of principle for us, but I think it's also the only way to try to mitigate these great power tensions. There is this idea that China is a revisionist power that is trying to undo the international order. I don't think that is the case, or at least not yet. I mean, why would they? They've become so strong and powerful under the current system. They're an important stakeholder within the system. But of course, they are trying to get more influence within the system, right? What we must do here, I think, is to distinguish more carefully between what is legitimate and what is not. Is it legitimate that China tries to have Chinese citizens nominated in important posts in the international organizations? Yeah, that's what we do also, right? It is not a law of nature that the head of the IMF must always be European and the head of the World Bank must always be American, right? So maybe here and there we have to make some space for other actors. But it has to be done through legitimate means, of course. So I don't think China is a revisionist power that is trying to overturn the order, but it is naturally trying to gain more influence within the system. But I would also not say that China is a strong pillar of the current order, because the Chinese have a very cavalier attitude to the rules. They will apply them when it suits them and invoke them against others when it suits them, but they will happily disregard them when that suits them better, right? All great powers do that to some extent, including we occasionally, but the Chinese do it a lot more certainly than the European Union. So the challenge is to stand up for the multilateral system and try to convince the other powers that it is in their interest to maintain the core rules. Don't make war against somebody else. Reciprocate, apply the rules that you want others to apply, and don't create exclusive spheres of influence. I come back to that. That is my third point. Now, how do you do that? Well, historically, you see that you cannot try to create a rules-based international order, a functioning one, if the aim of it is to keep one of the great powers of the day out of it. Because, of course, the one that you try to kick out will not be happy and will try to undermine your system and or will try to create a parallel system of his own. That's not what we want. So the idea of the Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo this summer had this idea of an alliance of democracies against the Chinese, is I think precisely the wrong one. The good idea is the Franco-German one of the Alliance for Multilateralism, saying we don't need to ally against anybody, we need to ally for multilateralism. And you have a core of countries, perhaps the EU, Canada, Japan, a few others, that stand for a rules-based order and try to create thematic ad hoc coalitions that try to pull in the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians and the others to advance multilateral governance. That's a tall order, of course. We have one small success so far. There's the creation of a temporary WTO settlement mechanism with the Chinese, so very interesting. But of course, at the same time, the Chinese still disregard quite a few other of the WTO rules. But it proves you that it can be done. Number 3, connectivity, one of the new buzzwords of the day. Like many buzzwords, it's a new word for something that we've been doing forever, right? Every empire, every power always try to secure its lines of communication with its resources, with its markets, with its enemies. And that's why the Romans built all these roads. And in the past, we used to do that mostly through conquest, right? If you wanted to secure your access to certain resources, easy, you conquered the province in question or you colonized it. That doesn't really work so well anymore. So now we try to create connectivity by consent, and we try to make deals, agreements with the partner countries. Though, of course, the pressure to enter into a deal if you're facing a great power can be big. Everybody does this, right? And China has its very prominent Belt and Road Initiative. But as such, yeah, this is not illegitimate. It's not necessarily so different from the neighborhood policy. You offer an economic carrot, investment, trade, development aid maybe, loans, visa facilitation, and so on. You're trying to thereby push the country to orient its economy on your economy, and you try to create a political climate in the country that is permanently conducive to your interests. If you have such a connectivity scheme, as long as you don't force anybody to join it, or as long as someone who has joined it, you don't force him to break off his relations with all the other powers, then that is a legitimate policy. That is just politics, right? It may be irritating that the Chinese are quite successful at the moment, but yeah, irritation is not a moral justification to be against something. So if we feel that, yeah, in a certain country, China through the BRI, or here and there, Russia through its Eurasian Economic Union is gaining too much influence, we have to put a better offer on the table. There's not so much more that you can do. We must not forget, one, this is not a Cold War. If a country signs an MOU with the BRI, it does not disappear behind an iron curtain. Italy has signed a memorandum with the BRI. You can still travel to Italy, Corona permitting. And no country is waiting to become a vassal state of China or of anybody else. There might be one or the other exception. Many people would argue that Sri Lanka has fallen into a debt trap, but precisely because it has, now all the other states want to avoid the same fate. So it's not as if everybody is waiting for the Chinese to take over their country, but of course, if the Chinese have an offer and there is no alternative offer on the table, then they will gain a lot of influence. And we have now an EU connectivity strategy, but with limited budget. And I think it is, for the moment, not quite coordinated on the EU side. There's an ambassador for connectivity in External Action Service. Various Commission DGs do different things that are linked to connectivity. They might not call it like that, but there is no clear coordinated offer. And this is something, in my view, that we need to we need to think about to, in the end, what is our interest here, right? Obviously, the EU is not seeking to create protectorates or vassal states. Our interest is that all these countries in Eurasia remain sovereign states. So what we're saying to them is, look, we're not looking for clients, we're looking for partners. We're not looking for exclusivity. If you want to have a deep relationship with China or with Russia, by all means, be our guest. We'll just give you a hint. Don't put all your eggs in the Chinese basket. So here's a European basket. Put some of your eggs here. This is, I think, the only option that we have. Final point. If we want to do all of this, yeah, we need to secure the home base, of course, and we need to provide ourselves with the instruments, with the power to do that. And this, as always, is tricky in our complex system. The common foreign security policy, the common security and defense policy still work on an intergovernmental basis. So everything has to be decided by unanimity. And that, it seems, has become increasingly difficult in recent years. I have no magical solution for that. I'm a great believer, but it's easy to say as an academic, in the introduction of majority voting, even in CFSP. But yeah, those who have if you have unanimity, you can only abolish unanimity by unanimity. That's a problem. I think there's a shift, has been a shift when it comes to our economic power base. There is an awareness that the European market was too open, and we were the only ones. Every other power puts limits on foreign ownership, foreign presence in certain sectors. We have now started to do the same thing. We probably have to go further and make this more binding and find the right balance, right? There's a strong school in America that says, we need to decouple from China. That, I mean, if you want to, you can do it, but you will create an enormous economic crisis if you do that. So the aim is not to push China out. The aim is to say, in sectors that are too sensitive because they concern our security or because they give you leverage over our decision-making, we either put a limit on foreign ownership, Chinese or otherwise, or we, in some sectors, maybe there must simply be no foreign involvement. We must then identify those sectors and make that binding. Nobody is striving for autarky, right? I mean, everybody has realized because of the corona crisis that globalization creates problems if you have such a pandemic, that many supply chains are very fragmented. What you will probably see is that in certain sectors, we decide we need more autonomy. We want our own production capacity again, for example, when it comes to certain medical supplies. Then in other sectors, maybe supply chains will be simplified, that maybe parts to build whatever don't come from 150 countries, but from 75. But globalization will remain, right? Autarky is impossible. Every power has to import something in terms of resources. The only country that claims autarky is North Korea, and that's fake because they survive because of Chinese support. We must realize this. The final bit is then, of course, military power. And there also things are moving, but not quite fast enough, I'm afraid. We have permanent structured cooperation and the European Defence Fund to push the integration of our defense effort. I think PESCO is the instrument with the most potential so far, compared with all previous attempts to do this, but we're not making really good use of it. We're using PESCO like I use my smartphone. You know, I'm a bit old-fashioned. We were discussing over lunch. I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on LinkedIn. And for a long time, I didn't own a smartphone. Until my husband felt that I should have one, and he just bought me one. Then you had to explain to me how to use it. And after a few days, he said, yeah, clearly having a smartphone doesn't make you a smart man. So what do I do with my smartphone? I'm old-fashioned. You know, I actually make phone calls with it. And if there's free Wi-Fi, like here at Rome, I check my emails. That's it. So I use, clearly less than 10% of what it can do. And that's how we use PESCO. We use PESCO as if it were a mini European Defence Fund. We use PESCO only to do small collaborative equipment projects, but not in the most important areas. With one or two exceptions, the existing PESCO projects are basically marginal. So if we do all of the, 43 PESCO projects, Nothing will change, nothing. The point of PESCO, if you go back to the Council decision, is integration of forces. It's to say we harmonize our defense planning, we harmonize our equipment, so you all buy the same equipment, and we create deployable force packages in order to, in the end, arrive at a comprehensive full-spectrum force package. So this is not just about cooperation between national forces, this is about permanently beginning to integrate national forces into permanent multinational frameworks. If cooperation is permanent and structural, then it's actually integration. This is perfectly possible. Technically, this is perfectly possible. Nothing stops us from doing this, but we must make this leap. And for the moment, yeah, the PESCO strategic review is ongoing as planned, but it's sort of stuck in a bit of a procedural mode. But it should be a political and strategic debate. Which capabilities do we want? What do we want to be able to do with it? There is now a new initiative on the table. The EU will produce a strategic compass. It's a bit of a new term. It's a tricky one, because if you have a compass, what does it do? It tells you where the north is. It doesn't tell you that you have to go north. You still need to decide that. The idea is to create a sort of military strategy, a strategy for CSDP that links the big objectives of the global strategy with the practice of CSDP operations and CSDP capability development. I think clearly there is a bit of a missing link, but you have to make this really concrete. The question to ask is not which kinds of operations do we want to be able to do. The question is rather in which parts of the world, in which scenarios, do we think we ought to assume which responsibilities? Then you link that to your defense planning. If you make it sufficiently concrete, then this strategic compass, I think, can be an asset. If you don't link it in the end to your defense planning, it will be an interesting paper, and I will surely write an interesting article about it, but it may not have a lot of impact. Voila, that is my state of the union, so to say. It's probably very realpolitik. It's maybe not entirely satisfying, but this is also part of doing international politics, I think. And this is part of strategic thinking. The awareness that sometimes you have different options, and all options have very negative drawbacks as well. But you still have to choose one. And not choosing one is also one of the options, and also has consequences, right? So if in every situation there would be a nice option, that would be easy. But this is not the practice of international politics. You cannot, unfortunately, you cannot be a great power, which the EU de facto is, given its weight, and keep your hands entirely clean. We must try, but we must also know, final word, that we have to operate in the world as it is. The world as we would like it to be is our objective, but to get there, you have to adapt and prepare to operate in the world as it is. Voila, I rest my case there, and I look forward to all your thoughts, comments, critiques, maybe praise, who knows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven, for those very provocative thoughts on the future of Europe at global level. We are now waiting for your questions in the room, questions on Twitter with the hashtag JEI2020, and question on Mentimeter. Apparently, we're supposed to use that. The rector needs to go for another meeting. Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, WebEx.
Yeah.
Sorry. Bye.
Thank you so much for attending. So we already have one question here on Mentimeter, which is the new software that professors of the 2020 are supposed to use. What is your take on the strategic compass? You already addressed this one. Why do we need yet another strategic document when we already have the EUGS? Would it not be better to focus on the implementation of that one?
Yeah. Well, I think we must distinguish between the levels. The EUGS is our grand strategy, to use that term, so that covers everything that we do: diplomacy, defense, trade, and development. And then logically you have strategies for those specific areas. We don't have a clear strategy for the defense bit of the EUGS. That is how I see the strategic compass. Just like in the United States, the national security strategy is then followed by a defense strategy that is produced by the Department of Defense. This is how I see the compass. But so I agree with the sort of fear that is implied in the question. There is a big risk that this becomes another document that we add to the many existing documents, but that has little impact on what the member states do. And there's sort of one disease of the EU, especially in defense policy: we never cancel any document, right? We always adopt new documents, but the old documents also remain binding. And then in the end, of course, they contradict each other always a little bit, and then it becomes increasingly unclear what actually the strategy is. And every council decision has to invoke 12 or 20 prior documents, which everybody who negotiated the decision has forgotten what they say because they were negotiated before they were in their current diplomatic post, and that doesn't help us. So I would say if we adopt a strategic compass, delete a few old documents and say, this is now it.
Okay, let's alternate with a question in the room. Juan Manuel, here. We have microphone with sticks. Don't hit the students with sticks, please.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Juan Sanchez from Political Studies Department. We hear a growing narrative recently in grand strategy, which is choosing between, as you said, compartmentalizing chapters, making silos, and weaponization, which means putting everything in the same box, and until everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. I think, I have the impression, I would like you to elaborate on this, that the weaponization scheme is more an internal focused approach, maybe, to appease, let's say, the European values standards, but that in the end result of real negotiations, we are going always to be in the silos compartmentalizing scheme? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I will say I don't like the term weaponization so much. It implies that we're doing something new, as if all of a sudden, for the first time, we've discovered that you can use economic power to pursue your grand strategy. This is, of course, what grand strategy is and has always been, right? You have power, and power has military, political, and economic dimension, and it has always had, right? And every great power from antiquity till today uses all three to pursue its strategic interest. So there's nothing new in that. Just that, yeah, people always invent new combinations. That is clear. I mean, yeah, if you look at the practice, it's in a way strange. I find there is a lot that we talk more about the Uyghurs and about Hong Kong, but without really doing something about it. We condemn it. We maybe adopt sanctions against individuals, but nobody is suggested that we should cut our trade. But then where we could use our leverage, for example, Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, or Chinese assertiveness here, then we talk a lot less about it, right? That I would, for example, clearly say when you have sometimes very assertive statements by Chinese diplomats in Europe, then I would say, no, don't cross the line. You are here. We decide the rules here. You want to play here, you play by our rules. If you don't, then you don't. And there is where we have leverage. But at the same time, trying to maintain this balance, saying we can disagree on one thing, doesn't mean we have to disagree on everything. And compartmentalization is a kind of mitigation mechanism, because if every dispute has to lead to an overall dispute, then of course then everything moves to rivalry, and then we can't have good relations with anybody. So I think if we are smart as EU, we try to maintain this.
Thank you, Sven. We have a question online. The discussion focused, among others, on the domestic situation of great powers. How does the EU's internal situation with regards to democracy and rule of law relate to its position in the world?
Yeah, good. Again, yeah, asking the question is answering it, I suppose. Clearly, it's a bit difficult to go finger waving around the world if we do not manage to maintain our democratic system within the Union. Some member states are clearly backsliding, and this is something we can absolutely not tolerate. So when it comes to democracy, the main challenge is to maintain our own standards of democracy. And, you know, you can define grand strategy as saying, what is the point? The point is that you defend your way of life. It's a very American term, but you know, every state has its own way of life. We have as EU a certain way of life, a certain way of organizing our society. That is what we have to maintain. If, of course, internally you allow the way of life to slip, yeah, then there is no point. Huh? So the point of our grand strategy is not to defend a semi-dictatorship in Eastern Europe somewhere. The point of our grand strategy is to defend our way of life based on democracy and equality.
Yeah, later, you will be the next one. Alexandro in the back.
Thank you. My name is Alexandro. Thank you for the presentation, Professor. You mentioned the big players, Russia, China, US. How about the European neighborhood policy when you have many small states, especially in the Eastern Europe, where we have now some developments, some of them very worried? How do you see the EU strategy in that part of the world? Thank you.
I think, yeah, the maximum that we can look for is a bit like my third point about connectivity, or it is in our best interest that these states remain sovereign states. You know, the states of the Eastern Partnership, let's say, that those are states that make their own choices. If it is their own free choice to have closer relations with Russia than with us, fine, although we should urge them, I think, not to have only relations with Russia. That would probably not be smart, but that they make their own free choices. We have seen if you try to accelerate evolutions in those countries, that it turns out badly. We have seen that we must certainly avoid that you create a sort of artificial situation in which you force a country to choose between Russia and the EU. So we must make it clear that our offer is always non-exclusive. It is combinable with relations with other powers as well. That's of course not how Russia sees it, right? Because the Russians want a sphere of influence which is exclusive. But you see, we will see how the situation in Belarus evolves, but you see that Russia has realized there are limits, right? That what they did in Ukraine, yeah, if they would repeat that now in Belarus, yeah, they would probably antagonize the entire public opinion of Belarus, and so the approach is rather more hesitant. There's probably also the awareness that, yeah, if your influence in a country is linked to one person who happens to be the president, and if that one person is somehow brought down, it vanishes, and that's probably also not a good strategy. So is Putin wedded to Lukashenko? Maybe not as closely as we think, but he will certainly try to prevent Belarus growing closer to the EU. I think we must not try to rush things, but we must try to maintain freedom of choice for the position of Belarus as a state, and the same applies to the other ones. It's a kind of a sad thing to say, but look, if you look at the geopolitics, those states are kind of stuck between the Russian Federation and the EU, and they will probably remain buffer states for a while to come. That's not nice if you happen to live there. I mean, Belgium has been a buffer state sort of for a long time. I know what I'm talking about. But that is the geopolitical heart of the matter, I fear.
Okay. Emmerich in the second row. That Emmerich? You don't have a question? Okay. So I have a question on the web. Who are our natural allies beyond US? Is Africa the new partner to come?
I think the High Rep Borrell, of course, wants to revitalize our relations with Africa. And I very much agree that our approach to our southern flank, so to say, has become too negative, right? As if the South is only a source of problems. And many have the sort of reaction that the answer then is to fence ourselves off from the South, which can, of course, not work. So I totally agree. We must have a more forthcoming approach. you also see that, yeah, because we are in a period of increasing competition and rivalry between great powers, that they become more active everywhere. So if we decide that we decide, or through inertia, that we are not present in a certain place, the void is filled by Russia, and in the future increasingly by China. So it's a bit of a balance. We have to maintain a certain presence, and it has to become a more positive policy. But is Africa a source of allies, of partners? Yes, but probably for some time to come, their resources and the degree of organization to contribute to our grand strategy will be limited, I fear. We must just make sure, in the first instance, that certainly in our immediate neighborhood, North Africa, that other great powers gain not such influence that they can push some of our neighbors into directions that go directly against our interest. Thanks.
Thank you. Over that, Thijs, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. My name is Tim, and I had a question regarding China. So you have said that China did not necessarily try to disentangle the international system in as much as it is very powerful in it. So if they may not try to do so, aren't they rooting for like global hegemony? Like aren't the Belt and Road Initiative, debt trap diplomacy, the defense ambitions, the 2050 vision, all proof of a certain desire to take the position that the US is willing to vacate right now? And if so, how should the EU approach China in that desire? Thank you.
I mean, my reading so far is no, that if you look at Chinese grand strategy, in a somewhat counterintuitive way, maybe it is actually quite defensive. That no matter how powerful the regime may seem, the regime is actually worried, continue worried that it can be overthrown internally or can be aggressed by external enemies. And their mode is defensive. Of course, their way of response comes across often as very offensive, right? So the fact that in their mind it's defensive doesn't justify it or doesn't allow them to do that. But trying to understand them, I think they are very much in a defensive mode. If they claim the entire South China Sea, it's because they want to build a system of defense that can prevent the Americans from cutting off the eastern seaboard in case of conflict. One reason for the Belt and Road Initiative is economic outlet and to find another line of communication to the Indian Ocean via Pakistan or overland to Europe. So if you combine that also with Chinese strategic culture, then until now, the evidence would go against sort of great expansionist or hegemonic plans, in my view. Traditionally, the Chinese are also have a position of non-intervention. So, but then of course, the opportunity, if the opportunity is there, they might go further than they are now planning for, you see? And that is why I think the sort of balanced position is precisely so important. You don't have to say that Chinese, that they are the enemy. That doesn't serve any purpose. You have to say that everybody also has legitimate interest. Some of what they claim to be their interest is illegitimate, but everybody also has legitimate interests. And if another state pursues its legitimate interest in a legitimate way, yeah, it's fully entitled to do that. We must not help it to do that. We must not applaud them, but you can't condemn them for doing what we also do. But you must make it clear that we too have red lines. So cooperate when you can, but push back when you must, to make sure that there are limits and that our aim is accommodation, but that must work both ways. I think until now, signs are that this is possible, and we must do everything to keep it possible. Whenever I speak with Chinese colleagues or officials, I always say, Europeans want to work with you, but if you ignore that, don't be afraid if at some point then the Europeans begin to follow the much more confrontational American view, and you find yourself confronted with a new bloc, and we go for a new bipolarity. And that is not actually what China is seeking, because by and large, the Chinese prefer a game with more players. If it's just them and the Americans, and the Europeans again as a kind of deputy sheriff of the Americans, that leaves little options, right? Not so many combinations possible. If it's more players, then there are more combinations possible. And for sure, a new bipolar system would also not be in our interest because, as I said, we would again be a secondary actor, but this time in a secondary theater. Because if it comes to a new Cold War, the point will be Asia. It will not be Europe. Europe will be instrumentalized to fight a Cold War in Asia. So we must do our utmost to avoid that. But I mean, you're certainly right in the sense, it also depends on how China behaves. The more assertive and the more aggressive they become, then we may yet move to this tendency to bipolarity.
Yeah, very much in link with that, with a question on Mentimeter. Insightful analysis of the EU's China rivalry.
But
You mentioned also Russia as one of the great powers. Is its behavior not quite different from China's and requiring a different response from Europe?
yeah, I mean, my view is that the Chinese are very pragmatic, right? The Chinese foreign policy is driven mostly, China's foreign policy is like the foreign policy of Belgium, but at a slightly larger scale. It's driven by economic interests because the regime wants to be in power, doesn't care about ideology, it just wants to stay in power. How does it stay in power? There is repression, of course, and it promises ever-increasing economic prosperity. And that leads to a very pragmatic foreign policy. The Chinese can work with anybody, quite regardless of their domestic system, if it serves their economic interests. The only exception is what they claim to be their national territory. There they are absolutely inflexible and dogmatic. And the problem is, of course, that they claim territories as part of their national territory that are actually not part of the national territory. Whereas I think Russian strategy I see as double. One, the traditional strategy of creating a buffer zone in the West to shield off Russia from potential aggression, and two, regaining great power status. And that is also entangled very much with domestic politics because the Russian regime links its domestic legitimacy very much to its foreign policy, but that leads to the opposite of pragmatism. It leads to inflexibility. The Russian regime cannot offer anything beyond that. It cannot make any great economic promises. And so it's kind of stuck in this mode in which I think it has to prove its international assertiveness in order to keep its public on board. And so it cannot compromise, even when it wants to. And there's a sort of dogmatic focus to seek confrontation with the West, because it's easy. The Russians know, of course, that NATO is not preparing to invade. Their real geopolitical problem is China. But as Timothy Snyder says in his book, The Road to Unfreedom, they don't want to talk about the real problem, China, because if you talk about the real problem, you have to come up with a real solution, which they don't have for China. So they talk about the fake problem, which is Europe, and a fake problem doesn't ask a real solution. It requires a fake solution. And I think within Russia, there is clearly a strong school of thought among the academics and the think tankers that says, look, our foreign policy has become, is out of balance. We are very close to China. We ought to balance, but it doesn't yield so much benefits. We need to compensate again and normalize relations with the EU. But how to do that, they don't know, because they cannot compromise on Ukraine, also for reasons of domestic policy, so they can't normalize. Then some Russians have the idea that you first need to create a big Eurasian bloc, and then as Eurasia, you engage with the EU. But that will never fly, because the Chinese have absolutely no interest in making their relations with us conditional upon Russia. So my feeling is that Russia, has maneuvered itself into a strategic dead-end street with brilliant tactics, but with no clear long-term purpose. And that, in a way, the only answer on our side, therefore, is strategic patience.
Thank you. A question over there, Pablo, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Francesco from the political department here at the college. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that in foreign policy we should pursue our own interest. Would a common European army be in that direction? Would that be in our interest, or would it scare our neighbors? Or would it be a mean towards an end, or something else?
I don't think we should care what our neighbors say. I mean, clearly, if they would certainly, Russia, for example, would make a big fuss. Suppose we would do that and say this move of aggression. Of course, this is quatsch. How we organize our military is our concern, and it all depends on what to do with your military. My argument is always we need a much stronger military than we have for the purpose of using it as little as possible. And that's the paradox. Today, the perception is that we are militarily very weak, so nobody takes our red lines into account. Because I think, yeah, whatever we do, the Europeans won't react anyway. And so sometimes actually they do create situations in which we do feel forced to intervene militarily, but we're not very well equipped. Suppose we would have a much stronger power projection capability, then probably other players would take our red lines more into account, would listen more to our diplomacy, and so we wouldn't have to use it. But that's difficult to sell, right? So you have to convince the public and the political leadership to invest in the military so that we don't have to use the military. It's a tricky one, but clearly the only way we can do that, I mean, we have 27 armed forces in Europe. Most of them are small and at a very low state of readiness. It's not as if we have the choice to, acting alone or acting European. It's increasingly the choice between not acting at all or acting through an integrated European military.
Thank you. A question on Mentimeter connected to this one. How realistic is it for the EU to develop strategic autonomy in the defense sector given the economic crisis resulting from the COVID-19?
Yeah, there's of course that's a good point. Yeah, there is of course a big fear. I mean, one thing is for sure, the slower the GDP grows, or if the GDP shrinks, then suddenly the percentage of GDP that we spend on defense will increase, right? Which shows you how artificial this benchmark is. It's totally useless. Obviously, one cannot expect enormous investments in defense at a time when there are such enormous social and economic needs. But I think it would also be a mistake to do one at the expense of the other. I mean, in the debate, people often create a sort of contradiction between either you have a welfare state or you have a strong army. I would say the welfare state and defense are both core tasks of the state. If you don't have enough means to do both, the answer can't be to drop one of them, but to get the means. So we certainly need to invest a bit more in defense, but we are not trying to become a second United States in military terms. So if we would integrate a lot more and spend all the extra money in an integrated way, that would already take us quite far. So yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, but as long as you don't integrate, it's also not so useful to spend more money, because if we have a very wasteful way of spending our defense budgets, and if you don't change the way, then all the extra money is also to a large extent wasted, quite simply. So they go hand in hand. Of course, there are degrees of autonomy, right? If you want to say Europe should be able to defend its own territory if necessary without the United States, then you need quite big scale investment. The IISS in London, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, have calculated that. The annual defense spending of the EU member states is grosso modo 200 billion a year. They say you will need an additional one-off investment of 200 billion to reach total strategic autonomy, let's say minus nuclear forces. Yeah, that's not going to happen, of course, although, yeah, nobody's going to spend 200 billion 1 year. But if you say this is the objective, you spread it out over 10 years, so that means 10 successive years you add 20 billion to the defense budget, it doesn't seem that unfeasible either. But this will probably not be our priority project at this moment.
Okay, a question in the room. We have one here.
Thank you. Yuzo from the Pol Department. When you mentioned Chinese strategic investments around the world, you highlighted the need for Europe to make a better offer to these countries. It's been said that China gives money with no strings attached, whereas Europe, for example, has human rights conditionality and this kind of thing. but what are the things that Europe can offer that nobody else can? What is the better offer that Europe can make to, say, Central Asian countries?
Yeah, I mean, one is that to fund or co-fund the projects that the countries want, rather than what we necessarily propose, right? Their needs should drive this. Two is a link to our domestic market. Three could be technology transfer also. And we must not also see this in economic terms, because this is a package. Some countries are also looking for a political cooperation. Some countries are looking for security cooperation, which we can also offer. And it's just diversification of risk that we ought to advertise. We're actually doing a lot, but it's very disjointed. I mean, in many countries around the world, they get lots of money from the EU, but they're not so aware of it because they don't add it up. And they get part from one part of the Commission, part from another part of the Commission. They get something from the EIB, and they get a lot from the United Nations, which is actually funded by the EU, but they don't know it. And so we already do a lot, but we don't use it in a strategic manner like the Chinese are using it. The Chinese, in many countries, spend much less than we do, but create the impression that they are the game in town, even in Europe itself, right? And in many cases, this is not actually correct. So somehow we could, I think, get a lot more output from the input that is already there. I have a sort of vague hope, but I ought to look into this, that because of the current corona crisis, yeah, it makes ever less sense, since everybody's resources will be constrained, also for China, to have all these parallel connectivity programs present in all these countries. And maybe there could be an incentive now to say, okay, we must pool our efforts and we can have joint projects that are driven really by the needs of the target country itself. But the idea that through connectivity projects we will greatly improve the human rights situation, that I think does not fly. What we can do is to maintain economic standards and to say, look, you can work with us, but you need to maintain an open and transparent economy and create a level playing field. And the advantage for you is then you can do business with everybody and you avoid the risk of becoming totally dependent on either China or Russia. And the EU is a very important actor in terms of setting norms and standards in sort of technical and economic norms and standards. And you can link that also to food safety, to ecological norms, to social norms, and so on. But to leverage that into really altering the political regime and the nature of its regime is in many cases going too far, sadly. Then you touch the limits of what conditionality can reach, and we've seen that in the past.
Thank you, Sven. We have a question on the web. We are witnessing European engagement outside the EU framework, such as the EI2, that's the European Intervention Initiative, and the IMASO, that's the one in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
How do such initiatives relate to the EU's security and defense efforts?
Yeah. Well, two sides. One is an operation, and what you see in reality is that certainly any operation that involves combat or a risk of combat, states don't want to do it, neither through the EU nor through NATO, funnily enough, right? Then they just prefer to do it by themselves, or they create an ad hoc coalition that they can control and they can act swiftly. And what do we do as EU and NATO? We do peacekeeping, we do capacity building, pre-positioning, patrolling, and that sort of thing. Clearly, this means that our current decision-making system is probably a bit too cumbersome when it comes to actual crisis management. I think this trend will continue. EI2 is another thing. In EI2, well, the way I read it is that France is trying to create a sort of permanent pool of partners from which it can generate ad hoc coalitions for specific operations. And what they're doing there is thinking a priori in different working groups. And there are fun working groups. There's one on the Caribbean. There's one on the Sahel. There's probably a bit more of a hardship working group. They are thinking, okay, if scenario A or B would happen, what is actually our responsibility here? What is the European interest at stake? What should we be able and willing to do? And so you have a degree of pre-planning And of course, the hope of France, as I understand this, is that if then one of these scenarios would materialize, that those countries who are in EI2 would actually be willing to join France in a military intervention, if and when that is required. This is also a debate that we don't have in an EU context. We just have a very general debate about types of CSDP operations, but we don't talk about why, when, and where we should actually launch them. But eventually, I feel we should link that to our defense planning and say, if you have a prior idea of what it is you want to be able to do, then that should inform the force package that you're trying to build through PESCO. And for the moment, they're rather disconnected. We're now going to have this strategic compass. I would say what we're already doing in EI2 is precisely what should now be transferred to the bigger EU level in the strategic compass. But that is very politically sensitive, of course, right? Because now you're not talking in abstracto saying the EU should be able to do a peace enforcement operation within 5,000 kilometers of Brussels at this speed and with so many people. No, then you're going to have to say things like, you know, if hypothetically a civil war breaks out in Algeria, then this is what we should be able to do. It becomes much more political and sensitive. And we'll see whether member states will be willing to have this kind of debate.
Thank you. Yeah, please, here, second row.
Yeah, good evening. Hello, everybody. So I'm more interested in the European Neighborhood Policy South. And so after 25 years, after the Barcelona process, 10 years after the creation of the UFM, nothing is concretely working. So, and Europe somehow, because as a Moroccan who have lived in Tunisia and having been engaged in some research about the development of the democratic transition in Tunisia or the economic revolution of Morocco, I feel like Europe seems to be the savior of these countries concerning their development. But then why does not Europe engage with the North African countries, for example, from Morocco to Egypt in a regional, in a project with regional dimension to engage all of these countries to kind of like foster the South-South cooperation? Because if we as Moroccans just concentrate on Europe as a big share of our foreign policy, Tunisia does the same, we will never arrive to a regional cooperation, and this will continue with the problem of migration, with a lot of things to Europe. So I feel like it's, I don't know, but this is my point.
Very good point. You know, I wrote my PhD about the Barcelona process and the security dimension of it. I published the book in 2003, and you know, it was a good choice because nothing ever happened. So the book didn't need any updating. It remained d'actualité until the Arab Spring. Then it finally became out of date. I mean, these are sort of recurring discussions in this. I think, objectively speaking, you're right. We ought to have a strong regional dimension, but the problem, as I understand, is always that the countries of the region don't want that. Like, seen from Europe, this is a region, but the countries of the region don't identify as such, and so you can't force them to self-identify as a region. If they don't feel they are not if they do not feel they are a region, they're not a region, and we can't, you know, you can't force them to cooperate. So we're stuck, I think, in a mostly bilateral mode, I fear. Same time, I think we should be more realistic, sadly maybe, about what we can achieve. Do we, for our interests, right? Again, I'm in a very realpolitik way reasoning from the European interest. Is it necessary that all our southern neighbors become European-type, EU-type democracies? No. For our interests, no. What we need is states on our southern border that have a political regime that is sufficiently accepted by its own public, so that it is stable, so that its armed forces would be willing to fight for it and to sustain it, so that if there is a security problem, they can deal with it. That may be a state that has far less respect for the rule of law or human rights than your average EU member state, but from the point of view of our interest, that is a sufficient objective for our security. If you try to push it further, then you see often it doesn't work anyway, right? Mali is a case in point, where we've been doing capacity building for 8 years, and the army that we have trained has now committed a coup d'etat. And we supported the president, who then it turned out was actually not so popular. A lot of the public seems to support the coup d'etat. Should we now be unhappy and say, okay, we stop our cooperation with Mali? Or should we say, well, okay, if the government that is now put in place by the coup d'etat actually can garner sufficient political support, public support, well, then maybe that is good enough. It's kind of that maybe, no? Colin Gray always says, no, you never try to aim for perfection in strategy, it doesn't work. Your strategy should be good enough, which is better than the other guy's strategy, right? Or Rupert Smith, General Sir Rupert Smith, who wrote The Utility of Force, published a new edition, who also said, yeah, whenever we do interventions and so on, maybe we should learn to be happy, satisfied with a more modest target, because we tend to define unlimited targets which we cannot reach, and then interventions tend to become without end. Again, maybe not very nice if you are in one of those countries to hear, but probably more realistic about what it is that we can achieve, what is really feasible for us.
Thank you so much. I will take a question from the web. Should the EU have a seat at the UN Security Council, perhaps the France one, in order to have a stronger weight between China, Russia, and the US?
Should I leave that one to you, Olivier? Ideally speaking, you would say yes, an EU seat would make sense, especially if, I mean, I'm a strong Euro-federalist, right? So let's say my desired end state is the EU becomes a federal state. We abolish the national foreign policies as only a single foreign policy that's decided by QMV. Yeah, then it would make sense to have a single EU seat in the council. That ideal scenario will probably exist first in my writings and for a long time before it becomes reality. In the meantime, therefore, then we also have to be pragmatic. My previous boss at the Institute, the head of Egmont, is always a diplomat, and he was one of our perm reps to the Security Council, notably the previous time Belgium was in the council. We're in the council now. And he said, yeah, we have now 4 or 5 seats, depending on how many temporary members we get elected. Why would you volunteer to reduce that to 1 if the others don't do it? So that's also something that. So an EU seat makes sense if you have a totally new council, in which you have an AU seat, an Arab League seat maybe, a Mercosur seat, and then there are some players who are so big they will always have a separate seat. China, US, Russia, maybe some others. So it's very attractive, and intuitively I'm all in favor of it. But 1, it only makes sense if we really have a single foreign policy, and 2, if the entire composition of the council is based on big regional players and a few great powers, I would argue.
Thank you.
And France has to agree, of course.
Yeah, we will. Clear here in the second round. Thijs, could you?
Good afternoon. I have a twofold question, again about our relationships with China. For one, China has a lot of interests in European ports. I think the port of Bruges is entirely in the hands of China. So, as you said, we need to be more reciprocal in our relationship with China, but didn't we give away too much of our leverage from that point of view? And secondly, aren't we hindering the creation of European giants when it comes to competition with China? Like the cooperation between Siemens and Alstom was hindered by the Commission as well. So we're giving way for maybe the biggest Chinese companies without creating European alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, on the first one, I think you're right. I mean, we woke up kind of late to this. So in many member states, a lot has been sold already. There's been some sort of lucky escapes, like the electricity grid in Flanders, which at the last moment was not sold. So yeah, we came late to this realization, but at least the awareness is there now. Not to the same degree in every member state, mind you. This is why I feel that probably we need in the end a more binding EU regime, because the current screening regime in the end leaves the decision with the national authorities. But you could say that you have a core of countries, France, Germany, Benelux, some Scandinavians, who have now become a lot more careful. And that is also the economic core, right? So if they are now on that route, then it means that you have a very severe limit on how far China can go. So that in a way, I think that that's an important shift in our policy. But we must stick to that, of course. It's in a way a bit sad that maybe to some extent the EU is already divided into sort of groupings when it comes to how to deal with this. But that's our mistake. On the second one, you know, I'll be very unprofessorial. I know I'm supposed to pretend to have the answer to everything. I really don't know. I've read about this, and I don't know what would be better, to allow sort of these mergers and create these champions, but with the downside that in some areas you only have really only one European firm left, or no. I really don't know, and I'm not enough of an economist to argue about it. What is clear, though, is that, yeah, if you don't want the Chinese to have undue influence in certain areas, you must have your own suppliers, right? And in the 5G dossier, that is very clear. It's all nice to say you don't want it to be Chinese. I would say, you know, in many cases also, it's not just I don't want to be Chinese, I just don't want it to be non-European, right? But then do we have our own suppliers? That's sort of the angle from which I look at that. But luckily I have a brilliant PhD student who looks at all this geo-economic side for me.
I have a question on the web. I'm not sure I get it, but maybe you will. Would transnational issues such as climate change, development, feminism, demographic change reinforce the influence of the EU in the world, or EU stance would be just an asset towards its allies?
What's the last part? Or EU?
Or EU stance would be just an asset towards its allies?
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely get that one either. But
okay, so it's not me.
I mean, sometimes I get sort of red because I say, okay, you talk always about great powers and grand strategies, but surely that's not all there is under the sun. There is climate change, there is migration, there is energy scarcity, and so on and so forth. And that is true. And certainly if we don't somehow mitigate the consequences of climate change, in the end, there will be no more great powers or small powers, okay? But you can also not solve those issues without the great powers, or it would be very difficult, right? If the great powers don't apply the climate change regime, yeah, it will not work. So they are really interconnected. But you could argue, I think, that these transnational challenges, global challenges, are an argument in favor of multilateral cooperation between the powers. And that is exactly what we should play into. That we have to argue, look, there are certain areas in which everybody has a stake in a strong international order, because eventually it will turn against you. The difficulty will be to convince some of the other powers that, yeah, the international order is a package. You can't say, I like this bit, I apply it, and I disregard this other bit that I don't apply. I mean, look, there will always be a degree of selectivity, right? This is international politics. This is how it is. But again, the core rules in the core areas, we must somehow get the great powers involved. You need a sort of grand bargain, if you want. Julian Howard likes to use that term. I mean, clearly the Chinese are aware of the climate change problems. Eh? Of course, they're also aware that we like it when they talk about it. So probably, you know, they sort of, yeah, you all know it. If you would take an oral exam with me, you would probably say something really nice about the European army, thinking, you know, that will not be bad for my score. So Chinese know if they say good things about climate change, the EU will be happy. But I think they're also aware of the problem. So you can try and use this, I think, yeah, to build some degree of cooperation.
Okay, we have a question here, Pablo, please.
Good afternoon, Eduardo from the Pole Department. Professor, you say that the PESCO is concentrating especially on small equipment programs. On the basis of the information we have, do you think that the crisis response operation core is fit for purpose of creating a full spectrum of forces for the European Union?
Yeah. Well, this is a very, the CROC is the project with the worst name ever. If you're military, do you want to say, I'm the general in command of the CROC, you know, CROC monsieur, CROC madame. It's a really bad acronym, but it's a really good idea. This is to say, let's create a force package. We use national building blocks and we anchor them in a permanent multinational structure. I've just published an article in Survival about this very idea, which I'm happy to share if you want. But we're not using it this way yet. For the moment, the CROC is used to create a brigade, a single brigade. But yeah, Belgium has a brigade. Even Belgium alone has a brigade. We don't need the EU to create a brigade. We have one. So you need to say the brigade is not the end state. The brigade is the building block. A brigade, for those who don't know, is, let's say, a couple of battalions, 5,000 to 6,000 troops with all the assets around it. With a few exceptions, all member states can still have one brigade. And if you anchor those brigades in multinational units with multinational support units around it, transport, command and control, then you arrive at a comprehensive full spectrum force package. So that in the end, what to say, your core units, your combat units are still national, but they're part of a multinational package which in its entirety is an army. But every national contingent separately is not necessarily a force that you can use. But the combination is a sort of modular package from which you can generate a force for whatever it is that you want to do in a specific scenario. And that is how the CROC could be used. And if we do that, then we would hopefully rename it.
Okay, another question in the room? Yeah, over there, you have been very patient. Johan?
Thank you, good afternoon. I wanted to know if we have real interest in Taiwan, because you talked a little bit about Taiwan at the beginning of the lecture, and because it's the only, not real democracy, but strong democracy in this part of the world, but it's threatened by China, as you know. We have a lot of citizens there, a lot of companies. Do we have real interest, and if it's the case, why we don't act for that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I have a real interest in Taiwan because my husband is Taiwanese. So I have to say that I really care about continued existence of Taiwanese democracy, and I do. I mean, again, you know, to put it somewhat crudely for the sake of the argument, we care about Taiwan because it is a democracy, of course, right? Had Taiwan still been a dictatorship when the Cold War ended, we would have dropped it, right? Just like Belgium dropped Mobutu in Congo when the Cold War ended because we no longer needed him. When we needed anti-communist dictators, we supported them. When we don't need anti-communists anymore, we dropped them. But Taiwan is a vibrant, is a real democracy. It's first Asian country actually that just legalized same-sex marriage also, and so we do care about it. Of course, in principle, every state recognizes only China. Every EU member state recognizes only China, the PRC, and not the ROC on Taiwan. But in reality, we treat it de facto as if it were a separate country because we have our own trade agreements with it. We maintain de facto embassies there. They're not called embassies, but we have the Belgian office, the Dutch office, and so on and so forth. So the reality is that we are all basically hoping for the status quo, which could go on for a very long time if you wanted to. Is there much more that you could do? It's difficult. We could always, I think, beef up our economic relations with Taiwan because Taiwan's main trade partner is now China, is the mainland. We could, I think, politically support Taiwan when, for example, it asks for WHO membership. But at the same time, you should be careful because if you push too hard, you may trigger actually what you precisely want to avoid from the Chinese side. So probably the best way ahead, or the best thing that can happen, is just the status quo. But on Taiwan itself, people are getting worried. One, because they've seen that the one country, two systems idea doesn't work in Hong Kong. In the end, it just becomes one country, one system. Two, there is a fear that a more assertive China might want to force the issue. Whereas until now, China has been operating very cleverly, but very slowly under the radar screen. If you're on Taiwan, you notice that many TV stations are basically giving you the voice of Beijing. Many newspapers are giving you the voice of Beijing. So slowly, Chinese influence has been growing. But now by dealing the way they've dealt with Hong Kong, they've also stopped, put a brake on their own influence. And I think young people in Taiwan just feel Taiwanese and don't have this idea that they need to return to the mother's warm embrace, as the PRC often phrases it. But so it's a difficult one, because if you don't want to provoke the Chinese into an overreaction by giving too strong support to it, but you do want to support probably the status quo, and if there's any change, it has to be a peaceful change with mutual consent. That would be my position. I hope that's sufficient, because it's my husband who does the cooking, so if he doesn't, and I do the washing up, if he doesn't agree, it will be sandwiches tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven. We are running out of time, so I think it's time to give another round of applause to Sven.
Thank you.
And I now leave the floor to Florian Trauner, who is professor at the VUB and College of Europe in Netherlands, and who is a co-sponsor of that event. Florian.
Thank you. Dear Sven, dear Olivier, dear colleagues and students, it's a big pleasure for me to kind of conclude and round up this event. As Olivier has mentioned at the very beginning, I'm here as the chair of the EU and International Affairs Conference. And this J annual lecture was originally scheduled as one of the highlights of this conference. The Journal of European Integration and our conference have had a very fruitful and constructive cooperation in the last edition of the conference, and it was meant to be repeated for this year's conference and also future editions. But the coronavirus has made us change our plans. That's why we are here. If you haven't heard of the EUIA conference, I will briefly present its key features. So the European Union and International Affairs Conference takes place every second year. It brings together around 450 policymakers and academics to talk about all kinds of international engagement of the European Union and international affairs more widely. We have a link of policy length panels and keynotes of senior policymakers. So last time, for instance, there was Michel Barnier talking about Brexit and the international implications of the altered EU-UK relations. So it's organized by 5 academic institutions: the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the United Nations University, UNOCRIS here in Bruges, Egmont, the Royal Institute for International Relations, and the University of Warwick. Please let me warmly greet the participants and the community of the EUIA who are following us online today. We have recently taken the decision to organize our postponed conference primarily in a virtual edition in May 2021. We are working right now on some digital innovations and plans, and we will streamline all of the key events. So please let me also allow to reach out right now to the students of the College of Europe. If you're interested in the EU's international role and would like to follow our keynotes next May, there are new opportunities to do so right now on distance and virtually. So if you're interested, you may follow us on Twitter or visit the EUIA website and check what's going on there. Now back to you, Sven. I'm supposed not to let you off the hook too easily, but at the same time, I haven't read the script beforehand, so for me, it's all a bit new as well. But I have thought, what could be the takeaway messages of your talk today? So you said, in a way, you're really influenced by a realpolitik approach. But if you read carefully between the lines, I think there is not so much realism, realpolitik, but a real, very strong dose of optimism underlying everything what you are saying. This concerns, first and foremost, the nature of international relations. I think if you believe Sven, you don't have to be either fatalist nor naive. Sometimes nowadays it's become very difficult to remain optimistic about international cooperation more widely. You open a newspaper, you read, US trade, sanctions on this. You have the impression there is really an escalation spiral in terms of how cooperation goes down. But I think what your lecture teaches us, or should us think of, is that even competition doesn't automatically lead to conflict. Rivalry is good if managed to some extent. We don't have to go down the path towards conflict automatically. There is a way to handle it if you're really interested in your core interest, if you define them, if you have respect for one another, and if you can really get along on the basis of such a thinking. I think there are two other takeaway points based on this. The first one is a deep belief in the European possibilities. I think here we have a primarily European audience. I think it's really the idea that you put forward as well, that if the Europeans believe in their own possibilities, it's a way forward. It doesn't have to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, just that the EU is not a superpower or a great power in security terms, that we cannot be influential in an international stage. It's really a question partly to believe in yourself and then to act accordingly. And the other way is there's a deep belief in multilateralism more widely, that multilateralism should, even if right now you sometimes have the impression some key actors internationally, they really have a very low esteem of international organizations. UN doesn't mean that the end of multilateralism more widely is necessarily to come. You can act up in it, you can work together for common goods, and there is more need than ever to do about this. So there's you several times referred to some songs to it as a kind of a concluding word. I think the takeaway message for you is we shouldn't, as Europeans, we shouldn't believe that we have to go for another brick in the wall, but more for an imagine that another world is possible. Thanks a lot, Sven. Thanks a lot to the Journal of European Integration and Olivier for hosting this event, and thanks for you here present and online for following us.
Thank you very much. Quickly, because no cocktail is waiting for us. This is forbidden. Thanks so much, Sven and Florian, on behalf of the whole editorial committee of the Journal of European Integration, who followed the conference online. I would like to thank also the IT staff of the college, Julia, the editorial assistant of the journal, the Paul assistant, especially Pauline, who organized everything. Be sure to read the full version of the paper of Sven BISCOP in the next issue of the Journal of European Integration. I hope to see you next year for the 4th annual lecture of the Journal of European Integration. This will be in Rome for the conference of the Standing Group on European Union of the ECPR, June 2021. It will be a virtual conference because we cannot postpone endlessly scientific events. And we'll have the pleasure to welcome our dear friend Vivian Schmidt from Boston University, the most European US scholar. And she will come to address us with a fascinating topic, which is the discursive construction of discontent, varieties of populism, anti-system ideas, and discursive networks in Europe. This is very promising. So thanks again, and see you next year.